so every time you see this sort of promising technology, you see on the outer edges there's these con men and fraudsters just waiting to capitalize. And it's also something that we've been doing since the start of time, is conning people into thinking that you can offer them immortality. But yeah, the one thing you find when you go into this research in longevity is that we really don't know that much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Parton, and you are listening to the Feedback Loop on Singularity Radio. This week, our guest is business and technology reporter Peter Ward. Earlier this year, Peter released his book, The Price of Immortality, The Race to Live Forever, where he investigates the many movements and organizations that are seeking to increase the human lifespan. From the Church of Perpetual Life in Florida to some of the biggest tech giants in Silicon Valley. In this episode, we explore Peter's findings, which takes us on a tour from cryonics to mind uploading, from supplements to gene editing, and much more. Along the way, we discuss the details of how one might actually achieve immortality, talking about senescent cells and telomeres, discussing whether it's better to live healthy than to live long. We also discuss the scams and failures that seem to dominate the longevity space, as well as the efforts that seem the most promising. And now, since we're on the topic of discussing how precious life is, I'll waste no more of your precious time. So everyone, please welcome to the Feedback Loop, Peter Ward. Well then, Peter, thanks for joining me. I think the best place to start is in April of this year. You released a book called The Price of Immortality, The Race to Live Forever. And where I love to start with anyone who's written a book is just hearing about your motivations for the book. Why did you decide that this was a topic worth exploring?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show. To start off with. So my first book was about the privatization of space, and how that was moving things along in the space sector, and what the challenges and what the potential consequences of that were. And then one of the sort of questions that kept coming up with the space enthusiasts who I was talking to was, how are we going to get beyond sort of Mars? How are we going to get beyond the solar system when it's going to take so long? And, we're going to die on the way there probably. So longevity sort of came up in those conversations, and I quickly sort of became fascinated by it. So after I'd finished the first book and I'd taken some time to sort of recover mentally and physically, I looked into this topic, and I instantly found it absolutely fascinating. And the more I got into it, the more fascinated I got. And I found this church in Florida, the Church of Perpetual Life, which seemed to be sort of the most extreme iteration of this idea. Not necessarily, I think, the most sort of serious, maybe. It's not the most scientific, but definitely the most sort of fanatical approach to it. So I went down to the church and I met the people down there, and they were really nice and introduced me to the topic. And they were everything I hoped for, very eccentric and really enthusiastic. And yeah, so it went from there, and the reporting just sort of went on.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship, I feel like, between religion and immortality is obviously one that is very closely entwined, but not so much technology. Do you feel like a lot of the people who are technologically inclined and pursuing some form of longevity and immortality are operating on a similar religious instinct, or do you feel like, from what you've seen, it's more just curiosity?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It sort of changes from group to group, I think, and
Mm-hmm.
person to person. Some of them completely fit religion into their idea of immortality. So the Mormon Transhumanism Association, for example, they it fits almost perfectly into their religious beliefs. And so you can see where they're coming from with that. Other people, they sort of hold on to their traditional religious views at the same time. And the way most people sort of justify it is they say, well, all religion preaches that immortality is available at some point, all Western religions, certainly.
Mm.
Um, And so they just say that, well, instead of just waiting for it to happen, instead of waiting for, heaven on earth to happen, we're just going to go ahead and make it happen. So that's how it sort of fits into religious views. And then there are other people that are staunchly anti-religious,
Mm.
which you can imagine. They just don't see it fitting at all. They think, this is the next step, that we've outgrown religion. So it's really interesting talking to those people and seeing the whole sort of range of opinions coming out. And when religion's involved, it's always messy. So I had to sort of tiptoe around it a little bit, but a lot of people, particularly the anti-religion people, were very happy to share their views.
Yeah.
So yeah, really fascinating range of opinions.
Did you find much conflict in that regard? Did you see some, as you were approaching these people and asking questions, did some different opinions kind of start to butt heads, or did you even find yourself with, like, I don't know, a protest outside the church or something?
So yeah, I think some people are awkward about it. Like there's some aspects of it that I think the deeply religious people are very scared of, I
Mm,
guess. It's called You're sort of encroaching on their turf when you start to say you're going to live forever. So it's for some people they're always going to say, this is witchcraft, almost just
mm,
modern day witchcraft. But I think in terms of the people I spoke to, there were some people that said, "Oh, why are you talking to the church? That's just people hanging on to, the remnants of religion. It's not needed. We don't need it. This is transhumanism, and we don't need religion." And then there were other people, obviously, that still held really religious views. Um, so yeah, I didn't see anything sort of any sort of clashes. There were no sort of people at the gates trying to get in and shut them all down. But I definitely felt that there was friction within it. It wasn't. It
mm.
wasn't. It was sort of bubbling under the surface, I think. And I think if you got them in a room and brought up the topic of religion, everyone together, it would definitely cause some friction.
Sure. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about the Church of Perpetual Life and kind of some of the ideas that they were putting forth?
Yeah, so they're a registered religion, they're an official religion, and they essentially their members believe that they can live forever through the use of technology. So they believe staunchly in this concept of escape velocity, which means that you only need to live for a certain number of years, more years. So let's say the number sort of changes. Obviously, it gets pushed out every now and then. But they say, for example, if you can live for 30 years, then medical technology will reach the point where you can live for another, say, 30 years. And then during that time, you'll get added another 100 years. And eventually, you'll just be able to choose when you die. Um, so it's leaning on that sort of exponential curve
Mm,
again, which we see so often in technology. And it's yeah, so they sort of gather together every month and they discuss it. It's the building is like a church. It looks a lot like a church. The services themselves are not so much like a church. It's more sort of presentations and
mm,
discussions. But occasionally someone does get up and really goes into the immortality quite heavily, and it becomes sort of like a sermon, like a church sermon. So yeah, they're really fascinating group and actually really nice people as well. They're all extremely positive. They're all
mm.
there's not a hint of sort of cynicism amongst them, which as a journalist, I was really relieved.
Yeah.
It's refreshing being a cynic myself. But
Sure.
yeah, so a really nice group of people, and obviously a quite an odd group of people as well, and really really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you'd have to love life if you wanted to live forever. So it kind of is a good self-filtering mechanism there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You need to sort of be enjoying what you're doing, and sort of block out certain things, I think, as well.
Sure. Did they have like a particular technology that they were most excited about? Like, did you see an emphasis on cryo, on mind uploading, on, any particular avenue that they thought was the most promising?
Yeah, cryonics was a big part of it.
Mm,
That was a huge part of it, but they sort of see that as the backup, sort of plan B. So if they are to die, then they think they should be frozen just in case they can be reanimated at a later date. So I mean, the audience is usually quite old, so you can see why that would appeal, just because the if they don't reach that escape velocity, then they're done for. So the plan B is that I'll freeze my body and then I'll be reanimated after the escape velocity. So cryonics was a huge part of it. A lot of it is about sort of supplements and things just to get you across that line to that escape velocity. So a lot of sort of talk of the latest sort of miracle molecule, which is going to make you live a little bit longer, which is going to stave off some of the diseases related to old age and the cancers and heart disease. That's a huge part of it. And then they do go into some of the sort of more out there technologies. There's not so much on mind uploading that I've seen. But yeah, it's definitely all talked about. It's all fair game.
Yeah. Well, in terms of cryonics, where is the state of cryonics right now? Because I know you talked a lot about in the book. There's several sections that really talk about the fumbles and really let's just call it big failures in the space. But where is it at now? Like, is it looking like there's real potential there now, or is it still kind of like people are holding on to something that sounds great in science fiction, but so far has been really poorly executed?
Yeah, I think right now it's the numbers are still really disappointing in terms of the number of people signed up to be frozen is very low, considering the world population. It's a tiny portion. And the number of people actually frozen is still extremely low across the world. So it's clear that the take up hasn't been great, and a lot of that I think is partly to do with what, like you said, the sort of the missteps of the early years, and the fact that it was just sort of taken forward by, I guess, hobbyists rather than scientists, who had some terrible failures, some of them almost darkly comedic failures.
Yeah.
But it is an interesting thought experiment. I was talking to someone about this the other day. What would have happened if Cryonics got off to a better start? Would it be something that we thought differently of today? Because if you really think about it, all it is just a different way of disposing of a body. You're just freezing it instead of burying it. And I think even people within it acknowledge that, yes, there's probably a 0.1% chance at the very best of them ever being reanimated. But they think that that's better than a 0% chance. So it is interesting to see if it becomes sort of part of the mainstream, if that would have been the third sort of option. You could be cremated, buried, or frozen when you die. But that just hasn't happened, and it's partly because there's been absolutely no progress on the side of reanimation. So it's really still a shot in the dark. You're relying on these sort of scientists of the future to figure this out, and nobody's really making any progress there at all. And whether it's possible ever is you can't ever say no, but it doesn't look like it right now. But then it's also why there's a big debate over how much you have to do in the freezing process. Are they freezing people well enough that they would be able to be reanimated in the future anyway? And then if the technology becomes that great, then will we be able to just reconstruct people from a single piece of DNA? And then the freezing process is pretty redundant anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all really hypothetical, and that's, I think, ultimately what holds it back, is that there's too many leaps of faith required to really get there with cryonics. And yeah, that kind of brings us back to religion again, I guess.
Could you tell us about one of the like darkly comical failures that you mentioned before?
Yeah, so there's a few in the book. I mean, I really like the Cryonics people again. So I felt slightly guilty putting in their biggest failures in the book, but it just sort of spoke so much of how this movement came about and how it evolved. So for example, like the first person to freeze a person was a guy called Bob Nelson, who was a TV repairman, and his sort of reign as the go-to guy in the cryonics industry. This is back in the 60s and 70s. Sort of ended with this episode called the Chatsworth Disaster, where he essentially ran out of money and just left all these bodies to decompose in this this cemetery, in this crypt. And yeah, so he has several sort of he wrote a book about it, which is Freezing People is Not Easy, was the title of the book. Um, and he was just all over the place, really. He was trying all sorts, and a lot of people think that he was actually just a complete scam artist. He was just taking the money and going off on great vacations, and meanwhile, sort of not putting much money into the actual freezing. So yeah, his sort of early days are really interesting. Then there was a later episode where a frozen head goes missing, because the LA a coroner's office in LA comes calling, because they believe that this head, that the person, the old woman who died, that they'd cut off the head and frozen it before she was actually dead. And there was a mix up in terms of there not being a doctor there to declare her dead before they did that. So it became this whole big episode in the late 80s, early 90s, in LA. And so they made a decision to hide the head. The coroner's office wanted it for a post-mortem. And if you do a post-mortem, then there's no chance of it coming back to life. Essentially, they think that's it, you're done.
Right.
So they hid the head. They took it out of the facility and hid it. And the police come along, they raid the facility, and they can't find the head. Yeah, and this poor old woman's head is just being sort of, just a reluctant fugitive taken around Los Angeles. And eventually, actually, they won a restraining order against the coroner's office. And that was actually one of their big victories. And in the end, they sort of had to back off. It didn't help that the coroner himself was a really nasty piece of work.
Yeah.
And just went after these people and sort of made them out to be sort of devil worshipping old lady killers, when in actual fact they were just sort of enthusiasts who were trying to move along science. Whether they were actually going to make any progress or not was another question, but I don't think there was a sort of mean bone in their bodies, really.
When you mentioned there as well that you believe the first guy might have just been kind of not faking it, I guess, but a little snake oil salesman, in a way. How much of the longevity movement and what you're seeing is kind of people just trying to make money doing the snake oil, exploitation route versus people who are genuinely putting in, real efforts to make this work and only promising what they think they can deliver?
Yeah, I think there's a large portion of it is the snake oil salesman, I think. Just because it's so easy. And it's also something that we've been doing since the start of time, is conning people into thinking that you can offer them immortality. It's like the oldest trick in the book, basically, for fraudsters. And if you go back through, the earliest literature, it's always these cautionary tales against chasing immortality. So I think, yeah, it's something that we've always done, but now it's a sort of more dangerous time because the technology is actually improving to help sort of things like anti-aging and to make us live a little bit longer and live healthier for longer. It's easy to take that and sort of wrap it into this immortality tale and sell it to people. Things like stem cell therapies, like there's obviously stem cell treatments are a hugely promising area of science that could be, incredible, the things that we do with stem cell technologies. But right now, people are offering that there are stem cell treatment centers out there which are offering things that they just can't do. They're just taking stem cells from anywhere and injecting them anywhere in the body and saying, "Oh, well, now you're going to be younger just because I put your own stem cells back into you in some place." So every time you see this sort of promising technology, you see on the outer edges there's these con men and fraudsters just waiting to capitalize. The same thing with the supplements. Not all of the supplements work, otherwise we'd all be taking them. And a lot of them, the research is just from, sort of mice at the very best. So something that will make a very sick mouse live a tiny bit longer is not necessarily going to make a human live longer, even if you are sick. So you get these sort of miracle supplements come up, and people spend an absolute fortune on them. And again, it's sort of playing into that sort of deepest sort of urge for humanity to survive, it's really easy to get someone into that con, um, because you're offering something that we all want to live a
Yeah.
bit longer.
And all you have to do is take a few pills. It's so easy.
Yeah, yeah, so easy.
Do you think the supplement industry, I guess, then would be probably be one of the bigger abusers or maybe exploiters of this longevity goal?
I think so. I think definitely it's one of those. It's not very well regulated,
Mm,
supplementary in the supplement industry. So it is quite easy. You don't have to go through any kind of regulation or proof of concept. Really, you can pretty much say anything. And it's kind of scary what they can sell you. But I mean there's really none of it is going to kill you. It's
mm.
just the worst it's going to do is going to lighten your wallet by a considerable amount, waste your time taking these, and then you're not going to live any longer. Um, so yeah, I think that's definitely one to look out for, because we have this really aging population
Mm.
in America and in Europe as well. We have very aging populations. It's going to become a bigger and bigger issue that we're going to have these uh, people looking for solutions to make themselves at least feel a little bit younger. And there's all these sort of so-called, these drugs out there. They're not really drugs, I guess supplements
Mm.
out there which they can take. And yeah, it's just easy pickings. There's going to be more and more people. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of regulation can be brought in around that, or whether we see it getting slightly stricter.
Right. I mean, thinking of supplements, it seems, I don't think anybody who's taking a supplement thinks it's going to make them live forever.
Mm.
And I think a lot of what I see in the longevity space is this idea of living longer, healthier, the health span versus the lifespan. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the difference between the two? And I don't know, maybe do you see the community being more of one than the other, and maybe kind of the efforts taking place in both regards?
Yeah, yeah. So health span is essentially I want to live healthier for longer.
Hmm.
So I want to die at 95, but I want to live a very healthy life until 10 days before I die. That's the ideal scenario. And then lifespan is just I want to live longer. So I want to live to 150. If I'm healthy for that, that's great. But I do want to just live until I'm 150, 200. Pick your number, I guess. Um, so it is a big debate. And health span is very much the more sensible and definitely more noble goal as far as I found. I got into both of them. All of the sort of gerontologists preach health span. That's what they're going for. So anyone that's really the scientists, anyone the professors, the academic side, they're all looking at health span rather than lifespan. Um, and then I think the lifespan crowd is a fringe of that, of the
Mm.
anti-aging crowd. There's definitely some crossover. Obviously, some people think health span, by chasing lifespan, you'll increase your chances of targeting health span. So their theory is that if we target immortality, then we'll definitely reach like 100 years old or better health span. Um, and yeah, one of the gerontologists I spoke to said, I said, is that a good approach? And she said, that's like saying, well, I want to improve the aviation industry, so I'm going to try and make people fly and put wings on them. So it's it's like it doesn't pay to. She was basically arguing that it doesn't pay to chase an inachievable goal. You may as well
Mm.
just go for what is possible. And health span is definitely possible. And improving the health span is would be an amazing thing to do, even if we did it even slightly. The sort of benefits for the world would be huge. And a lot of it is the same technology and the same
Mm.
science. It's just that the lifespan people think that you can take that science and keep going with it to the point where you don't have to die. Whereas, yeah, definitely all of the people I spoke to that are working on this, they're just focused on health span. A couple of the geneticists and the gene editing people did entertain the idea. Said, well, why not? Why couldn't if you can make someone healthy for a bit longer, why couldn't you just make them live for longer? Um, but on the whole, it's definitely you see the more serious people are going after health span. and the sort of fringe people and more militant people are definitely into lifespan. Um, yeah, but then if you ask the lifespan people why that is, they have a sort of answer. They say, well, these scientists can't say that they're working on lifespan because they won't get funding
Right.
because it sounds too ridiculous. Which may be true for some of them. I don't know, but everyone that I said to said no. We're just going after health span.
Yeah, what are they targeting with health span specifically? Is it like maintaining muscle mass and dealing with things like cancer? Like what are some of the, I guess, key focuses or foci of, fixing the health span issue?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is targeting what they call the hallmarks of aging, which is
Mm,
sort of on a cellular level. There's a lot of things that happen to our bodies as we get older. So it's things like telomere lengths. We hear that come up a lot with aging, the length of telomeres, and then but then the thinking changed, or whether we want long telomeres, short telomeres, Goldilocks telomeres. Um, so there's that. There's several other hallmarks, and they're all sort of very sort of on the cellular level, and they're targeting things like senescent cells, whether we need senescent cells, whether they do a job of protecting us against cancer. Um, and then on the whole, it's sort of treating, they like to say they're treating aging as a disease.
mm.
So rather than saying, people are dying of cancer or heart disease when they get older, actually what's killing them is aging, which is just creating the perfect circumstances in their body, I guess, and the perfect environment in their body for these things to happen, for cancer to happen and heart disease to happen. So yeah, the focus is really on those hallmarks of aging, and they're sort of different people are targeting different ones. Um, but and so the idea really is, I mean, some people think it would be like a magic bullet, which it would never be. I think the idea is to really go after all of them, and it's kind of like a whack-a-mole thing. Like some people, some gerontologists believe, no matter what you do, something's going to get you. So you really are going against it. You're up against it, but you can keep going against something. You cure one thing, and then it might actually cause you to, get cancer. So there's a weird sort of flip side of the coin of immortality. Obviously, cancer cells are immortal cells. So there is that weird relationship between living longer and cancer that it's always going to sort of, yeah, it's an interesting question. But definitely it's about sort of stopping the circumstances which lead to those life-ending diseases.
Yeah, and what are senescent cells? Are they just cells that can't undergo mitosis anymore? They can't divide and basically reproduce themselves?
Yeah, exactly. So when they reach the point where they're dead, they're called zombie cells.
Mm,
Some people call them, and then they sort of accumulate. And the bad thing that they do is they secrete proteins, which then sort of attack the tissue around them and damage the tissue around them. So there's several sort of approaches that you could take. Firstly, people thought, okay, we need to get rid of senescent cells; they're bad, and they're killing us, and they're leading to all these diseases. And then we realized, well, actually, cells go senescent so they don't become cancerous. So it is an important process for cells to go senescent. And then I think that more recently, there's been a targeting of that secretion to stop them secreting the proteins or to nullify the proteins which they secrete. Um, and so, yeah, those type of things are what makes us feel old, essentially. Like it contributes to inflammation, to all those feelings that you get maybe, when you're feeling very old or very hungover, I guess, whichever one,
yeah.
when you're younger. But it's yeah, so that's a really promising area of research, senescent cells and senolytics. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of drug. Already a lot of money has gone into it, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of drugs come out of the research.
Yeah, and while we're in the details a little bit, can you speak to telomeres as well, kind of what they are and their function?
Yeah, so telomeres are sort of seen as the sort of the cap that you get on the end of your shoelaces,
Mm,
and they protect the sort of cells from sort of fraying, like when the cap falls off your shoelace, there's fraying, and then damage is caused to everything out to the cells. So it's sort of believed that if you get as you get older, your telomeres get shorter, and that can open you up to all kinds of damage. on a cellular level, which is, the basic cellular breakdown of your body is then accelerated. So yeah, so the idea is to sort of, and sort of huge industries came out of this, and there's things that you can buy that will measure your telomere length, and there's no someone yeah one paper I read was that if you're buying a telomere reading machine, then it's not really what it says it is. It's an extremely hard thing to read, so you're probably not just going to buy it off sort of the shopping channel, and it's going to tell you accurately whether your telomeres are long enough or not. So yeah, so the idea there is that you would protect the telomere length. But then there was more research came out that said possibly too long a telomere length, and that will cause you issues. So we need to be a decent length. So you can see how these areas of research they can bring you great hope if you're following it really closely. But then over time, actually, the findings change, the research has changed, and then so you're constantly chasing these trends if you want to live a bit longer. And so the people that are really obsessed with it, they're just constantly reading these papers and looking for even the slightest bit of hope, and then just following the trend.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier too, the research on rats, but it's often sick rats. And in the book, you talk about, I think, jellyfish and bowhead whales, and kind of the amazing things that they do in terms of senescence and immortality. What are some of the things that we're learning from animals? Like, is there significant value in what animal studies are providing us in this regard?
Yeah, so I think the animals that give us the most information are the ones that live longer than you think they should.
Mm,
So the mole rat is a really great example. The mole rat lives much longer than anything else its size and type. So it lives a lot longer than other things. And for some reason, they're very resistant to cancer. Mole rats barely ever get cancers. Um, so well done to the mole rats, I guess. But so they're one of the really well-studied animals. And then there are other animals, like you mentioned, there's the immortal jellyfish, um, which is down the other end of it's absolutely fascinating what they can do, but it's not much you can take. There's not much sort of, um, information that you can gain from a jellyfish that you can then apply to a human. It's
right.
about as far away as you can get. And yeah, and there are other animals like the bowhead whales who just live really, really long. So there's definitely lessons you can take on how they are so sort of how they resist those diseases, because that's basically why they live longer, is that most of them are able to um, fend off uh, these diseases that kill other animals. So yeah, there's a lot to learn from some of them.
With the bowhead whales, do you know at all what the specifics were? Like, are they maybe, obviously, there's probably a lot of work to be done here, but is it something like they're just better at waste management for that secretion that you talked about from telomeres? Like, are we seeing anything in that regard? Because I think you said in the book these bowhead whales can live up to 200 years, which just seems remarkable.
Yeah. I actually don't know what the sort of latest research is on the
Mm,
bowhead whale. Just and the problem with them is they're extremely hard
mm,
to sort of to study, especially over 200 years, to see why they live. That's another problem with immortality research, is that you have to do it over a very long time. Um, so yeah, with the bowhead whale, I'm actually not sure. I'm sure there is some research out there. I can't remember off the top of my head. With some of the other species, sort of like turtles,
mm,
tortoises that live for a very long time, a lot of it comes down to their ability to sort of, a lot of them can live without oxygen for a very long time. And and so they're just very hardy species that just can go into a state where they don't use up much energy.
right.
Um, and I think that's probably the same with the bowhead whales, is they don't expend energy at the same sort of rate as other animals or other similar species. So I think that is one clue. Um, but yeah, the one thing you find when you go into this research in longevity is that we really don't know that much. Some of the really fundamental questions we're still guessing at, such as why do we die? Like, why do we die at this age, and why do other species die at other ages? It's really we actually don't know. There's theories why we die, that when we get to a certain age, we're no longer helpful to society or the tribe, and that we're just taking resources away instead of, contributing. But yeah, that's another fascinating question of why we have these things happen at certain points in the human lifespan.
Yeah, and you bring up a really interesting point there, that I don't know if I often see explored in this, which is the psychological impacts or societal impacts of if this work actually succeeded. And specifically, I believe I heard you somewhere else mention, and as you touched on there, the idea is that once we become great grandparents, we're kind of no longer useful to the resource management system that perpetuates life. We let the grandparent take care of the grandchild, but the great grandparent's kind of too old to contribute much, and they've done all the reproduction, so they're no longer evolutionarily fit. But what
Yeah.
happens when the great grandparent is living, for another 50 years, or they have great great grandparents that are living, like have any of these people that you've talked to or in your research, have you come across many people really considering what happens when you start having this many people living without, kind of dying and making way for future generations?
Yeah, it does come up, but it's largely, I found that it was largely sort of brushed under the carpet a
Hmm.
little. It's like the thing that they don't want to think about. Um, and people, major names in the longevity industry, like Aubrey de Grey, has actually come out and said we no longer should be answering these questions. They're so that he thinks the questions are so ridiculous that we don't need to consider them. So their basic argument, as far as I can tell, it might be more nuanced than this, is that if we've reached a point where we can conquer death, then we can fix anything else. Then technology has reached a point where we can fix everything else. So for questions like overpopulation, they say, well, we'll go out and we'll live on other planets. And for resources, lack of resources, we'll just we'll have ways, maybe we'll have the replicator from Star Trek, for example, which could well happen, but then it could also go the other way. We never know how technology is going to change society. And I think what it doesn't take into account is definitely that cultural and also political shift that there would be for having so many old people. And we're about to see it. I mean, we do have a lot of old people in certain countries right now, and you can see how it affects the politics. And you have, people voting for things that they're never even going to really benefit from because they're going to die in 5 years' time. And that can be infuriating for younger generations. Um, so imagine how infuriating it would be if they were just always there, as you had this block of voters. And also things just like wealth accumulation. Obviously, people get richer and richer and richer. Just imagine trying to get on the property ladder in a world where people live till they're 200. It's hard enough now. Um, so it would cause a lot of issues, and we'd have to sort of completely change society as we know it, sort of rip up the whole blueprint and just start over again, which might not be the worst idea, but if you started again based on those principles, then that could go really badly wrong quite quickly.
Yeah, and starting again, usually to create something new, you have to destroy something, and that phase between destruction and creation feels like it could be ripe with a lot of conflict and suffering, in order to complete that transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised more people don't. I guess, I guess it's not the focus, but it does make me think, the psychological and societal effects, like these things aren't something that we as a species can just engineer, our way out of. What happens to human dynamics when you change the conditions seem very important and like something that no one's really talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not one of our strong points as a species, really, is it? We don't we
Fair.
don't look ahead. We just kind of do it and then and then deal with the circumstances. Um, so yeah, you can kind of see why you would ignore it if you were just going for it. But and again, I think a lot of the people that are chasing immortality, it's a very personal thing. They're not thinking necessarily, I want to make the whole world immortal. They're saying, I individually want to live forever and experience the future. Um, So they're not thinking on in terms of the whole species, a lot of them.
Yeah. Did you come up against other philosophical, I guess, quandaries with this? And specifically, I think of things like the ship of Theseus. Are you familiar?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, like this idea of, let's say we're taking the mind uploading approach and we're transferring consciousness. Is that person that we, if we're taking the digital immortality route, is that person that we copy ourselves into? Is that still the same person? Is that something that anyone's talking about as well, or that you're seeing explored?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I really wanted to get into. And I think, when you take these questions to sort of, so I spoke to a couple of philosophy professors, um, and I got the impression it wasn't something they'd necessarily thought about before. They were absolutely fascinated by this group of people that was just going headlong into immortality without thinking about these kind of things. Um, because it is a really fascinating question, like what makes you you, and you really need to establish that before you go into most of um, the immortality routes, before you go down those paths, especially mind uploading. Like you said, if I uploaded my mind today, um, is that me, or is that just me at this age? Like that's a very different person that's just been uploaded to me at age 19 or 21 or 82.
Hmm.
Um, so it's this idea that there is one you, I think, if we're getting really philosophical now, um, is is troubling, and you do rely on that for a lot of these techniques, like the mind uploading. You do rely on the fact that there is one you. With cryonics, you sort of rely on the fact that your brain is you, um, but then you bring up things like memory, and we have a lot of memories which are triggered purely by context.
Hmm.
So there's some things that we won't remember unless we talk to certain people or we see a certain um, a part of town or a certain movie. It won't trigger that memory. So if you were to die, you got frozen and you woke up 300 years later or 500 years later and you'd lost all that context, would those memories ever return? They probably wouldn't ever. So is that still you? Are you still the same sort of, the same ship, to use the ship of Theseus? Do you still have those same carvings and marks and things which define you? So yeah, there are some really deep philosophical questions that need to be answered, I think, before anybody would were to rush headlong into this, um, particularly around memory and and identity and it sort of goes back to religion as well. Sort of some of the Buddhism, for example, says that um, we obviously we're reborn, but which version of us is reborn? Is it the version of us when we die? Is it the best version? Is it the worst version? Yeah, I think we think of ourselves as a sort of singular entity across time, and we're very much not that. So that really complicates the question.
Yeah, it makes me think of the Russian individual. I can't think of his name, but you mentioned him in the book, and he is basically recording all aspects of his life in the hope that the video recordings and things like this can kind of teach an AI, I guess, who he is and his personality, so that he can maybe clone himself in that future. But to bring that full circle, it seems to me like there's this shift maybe from the body being an important thing to preserve to the pattern and consciousness being an important thing to preserve. And that seems to change as technology changes. Is that something that you've seen as well?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah, some people take it very literally. Immortality is like your body has to survive. And then I think the further out you go into these sort of fringe sciences, the really out there stuff like mind uploading, it does change towards sort of, we're just trying to preserve the essence of the person, the personality of the person. And then that makes you think about the definition of immortality. Is it, do you have to have a constant stream of consciousness to live forever, to be deemed immortal? And that gets you into the really question that really sent me meant I couldn't sleep at night was are we living, when we go to sleep at night, are we losing consciousness? So is it the
Mhm.
same, are we still going on even during that brief period? because there's obviously when we wake up in the morning, we don't know that we haven't just woken up at that minute. That could be the start of our lives. There's so much is uncertain in our own brains. Um, but I think, yeah, so there's that question of consciousness and is a copy of you, you. And I think, yeah, what I think Alexei is his name. I think Alexei Popotov, I think.
Mm.
Um, and his question, his sort of whole theory is I'm just going to gather everything I can about me on the hope that some future, and it was an AI he was talking about. I think he was talking about an AI, which we had a great sort of clause in that, which hopefully the AI will not be evil,
Yeah.
which which we all hope, obviously. Um, would bring him back to life. But would it be him? Would it just be some copy of him? It's that question with this, bringing up Star Trek again. I'm not even a big Star Trek fan, but I'm going to bring it up again when they sort of teleport down to the surface.
Right.
Is that question, are they just being destroyed molecule by molecule and then a copy of them being put somewhere else so that they die like 100 times an episode? Um, yeah, it's that question of like what is immortality, what is living? Is it, do you have to have that constant stream of consciousness, which I just don't see that applying to the mind uploading. It's not you,
Yeah.
it's not me as I am now.
Do you see one of these avenues, whether it's the biological approach or the technological approach, being more viable than the other? Like, does it seem like maybe realistically the biological approach with supplements and freezing the body and just keeping this thing going longer is going to work better than just transferring the consciousness to the machine?
um I think I don't think cryonics or supplements will get us anywhere. I think if anything biologically it would be sort of gene editing,
Mm,
um and just changing our body in such drastic ways that we're no longer programmed to die. So I think that's the best bet in terms of biologically. Um, yeah, the mind uploading and taking the personality on into sort of the cloud or some kind of digital realm. It's just fascinating to me, but I just can't. I don't think I can quite get my head around it. It's such a
yeah.
it's such an enormous leap. I guess the other question is could you put someone in some kind of virtual reality space and then alter their perception of time in such a way that maybe they could live lifetimes in that simulation, which brings us to the the theory that we're already in one. Um, so yeah, I think that I just yeah, it just blows my mind when I think about it. And obviously you can't say nothing is possible, and you can't say weirdly that nothing has not already been done and we're not living it right now. Um,
Right.
but with biologically, I think gene editing, I think of all the things, that's an incredibly tricky thing. That is definitely one of the things where you change something here and you don't know how it affects something somewhere else. But if it was come down to sort of that's essentially just coding the
Mm.
body to do what to just keep going.
It also seems more reliable in this sense and safer in the sense that it's really hard to get someone to sign up, I think, for the first test to like destroy their consciousness and upload it somewhere else. Whereas if you just tell somebody you're gonna change a gene, they might be like, okay, I think I can deal with that. I'll try
Yeah,
that out.
yeah, I'll give it a go. If you're just flipping a switch, then yeah.
Exactly. Well, given all of the stuff that you explored in the book and all the people you talked to, what is your takeaway? How do you walk away from this book, considering where you started? Do you feel more optimistic that this is something that we're actually going to do, that we will, in the words of Aubrey de Grey, reach escape velocity? Or is this something that you're thinking, yeah, we've definitely gotten a bit too excited and we might be, at least a solid century or more out?
Yeah, I definitely got that impression that we're not, it's not imminent.
Mm,
And obviously that's an easy thing to say, and the argument against that is that, the exponential curve, it's just going to kick off in one go, which is a really solid argument. But reaching that escape velocities just seems so far off. Nobody's living longer. No mice are living to extraordinary lengths. No animals are living to extraordinary lengths that we're doing anything to. Um, so it feels like that original breakthrough is still a long way away. and whether our tools to create that breakthrough might improve, that would have an impact, of course. But yeah, my feelings going into it was, oh, this is a really cool concept. I'd be into it, maybe. And then I guess as I reported on it, the topic of health span came up more and more and more, and that just seemed like such a more important goal. Um, and I think one of the conclusions I drew in the book was that the death actually is a lot better. Well, it's not a great word. It's a lot kinder thing to happen than suffering. And that's really, health span is about reducing suffering, and lifespan is about reducing death. And death really is only bad for the person, for the people left behind. So I think that was my main takeaway, that we should it's sort of the wrong focus. We should be focusing completely on health span, on making sure that people are in a better state, and that would help us, help things even like the economy if we have a more productive population at an older age. So if we can focus on that, and then, sure, if there is an option to live an extra 20 years or 30 years, and I'm sure people will go down that avenue. But I think, first of all, creating a world in which we all want to live a little bit longer, is step one. And then removing the suffering and increasing health span is step two. And then maybe come back to me and ask me about immortality, I guess, at that point.
Yeah.
But those first two steps are absolutely gigantic. So it still
Yeah.
seems a long way off.
Fair enough. Peter, we're coming up on our time here, so I want to give you a chance to give us any closing remarks, talk about anything you're working on these days, tell people where they can find the book, whatever you want to talk about, feel free.
Cool. Yeah, so the book is available in all bookstores, Amazon, anywhere you buy your books. Although, if you want to choose Amazon, maybe go for an independent bookstore if I have my choice. Yeah, no, it's just been a fascinating time. The weird thing is, when I wrote my first book about space, I for months afterwards I was sort of sick of space. I couldn't even watch a movie about space. Whereas this topic, I can't seem to get away from. I find it absolutely fascinating, from the very fringes down to the very core science. It's something really cool to get into. And I think it's a topic that we'll see a lot more of, and I think there'll be a lot more books, probably much better written than mine, in the future on this topic. But yeah, in the meantime, maybe people can pick it up and tell me what they think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I enjoyed the book and I enjoyed this conversation, so thank you for your time, Peter.
Awesome. Thanks so much.